Okay, welcome everyone. In this session, we're going to take a look at CSS Grid and try to cover as much as possible from this really powerful CSS feature. So first, I'm going to start with a very simple layout. I'm going to use CodePen, and I'm going to be using the DevTools Elements uh, bar here panel, because this is the place that you probably want to have open all the times whenever you're working with JavaScript, of course, but Flexbox and Grid, because DevTools here on Chrome have this the ability to enable some helper tools, and you can actually see some of the things that make up the CSS Grid and the Flexbox that are not really visible when you work with HTML. So highly recommend that you have the Elements panel open and use the tools that we will be seeing throughout this course. I'm going to create a very simple layout. So I'm going to have a container that is going to have a class grid. Just like Flexbox, CSS Grid works by defining a container element, a parent element, and then inside that element, you create one or more elements or child elements. In the case of Flexbox, these are flex items. In the case of CSS Grid, they are called grid items. So I'm going to create, let me see. I have like 4 cells, so I'm going to create 4 items. And I'm going to use some Emmet abbreviations here just to write this HTML quickly. And we have 4 items. I have 4 items with class item, and then the cell 1, cell 2, cell 3, cell 4. I'm going to just close the JavaScript here and put some kind of like a outline on the grid parent so that we can see solid. So let me put something like this. Let me make the font size a little bit bigger so we can see. Let me make it 2 RMs. And then I'm going to also put some outlines around the items. Outline 1 pixel solid gray, just to see how they are like displayed. Now, this is a block element which takes up, as you can see, the whole width of the containing element, the body. In this case, the body has some implicit margin, so we can see some space here. I can get rid of the margin that is set by default from the browser, but I will. And then it's div inside this grid is another block element, and they also take up the width of the available space of the container element. So these are just block elements. Divs are block elements. Let me pick them up with an inspector. So no, let me, sorry, here. So this is a block element, and then we have 4 block elements here. So nothing really fancy here. Let me put a margin here on the grid just to give it some space to breathe. So this is just the layout that I'm going to be using on these examples. I'm going to fork this, and I'm going to move into the next step, which we're going to be looking at CSS Grid. Now I'm going to switch from the simple block layout for this element to make it a grid container. So in order to make any element a grid container, you just set the display to grid. And suddenly you will see that something changes in the elements panel. Nothing changes at this point on the screen. So you can see if I comment the display grid, it's exactly the same. So by default, we don't see any like visual change. The thing that changes is that we now have a grid container. We can see here that this is a grid, and I can highlight the same elements, the same width. Now, if I click on this, you will see that we just created our first grid. A grid is made up of columns and rows. In this case, we have just one column, which you can see here, and it starts from this number 1. This is These numbers are the numbers of the lines. So we have a vertical line here at the left, which has number 1. We have another line, line 2, vertical line, and these two lines make up this what is called the grid track. So this column, this one single column, is made up or is enclosed or is created by these two lines. And we have on the left side line 1, and on the right side line 2. So we have one vertical column by default, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. So by default, we get a single column in CSS Grid, and we get a single row, so a single column and a single row for each item, for each child. So if I add 4 more items here, you will see that automatically the CSS Grid will be now containing 8 rows and still a single column. So even though visually we see no difference at all with a simple like a block element, we have something underneath, under the hood, some kind of like system, some kind of like layout that gives us a little bit more power. So let me put this down. I'm going to be refreshing when it auto saves. It's going to refresh, so I have to re-enable the grid here. In your case, you will be working with your code editor and your web page, so you won't need to do this. So for every column and every row, we have 2 lines that make up the start and the ending of that column or row. So we have line 1 and line 2 on the vertical axis that make up column 1, and we have lines 1 and 2 that make up the first row. This is also called a grid track. We have lines 2 and 3 that make up the second row, and so forth. 3, 4, 5, 4, 5, and so. So this is how we in CSS Grid we see these lines, these columns, and these rows being created. These are the lines. This is the numbering of the lines, and apart from going from 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth, incrementally, we can also count backwards. So we can start counting lines from either vertical lines from the right side to the left side, or from the bottom to the top for the horizontal lines, and these become negative numbers. So when I want to count the rightmost line from the CSS Grid, I will start from -1, and then I will go, let's say, to -2. So from the right to the left, we just have the same numbering, but instead of saying 1, 2, 3, 4, right to left, we say -1, -2, -3, and so forth, just to distinguish between this kind of like different direction from which we can count the lines. And also in here, we can start counting from the bottom to the top, starting from -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. So it's exactly the same count or number of lines, but they're numbered in kind of like in reverse order in negative, as negative numbers. This is really important because you will often make use of these negative numbers whenever you want to do something starting from the other side of the CSS Grid or from the bottom. So these are the fundamentals. This is how a grid is created and how it's made up of these lines and these tracks and the numbers that we use to count them. So let me move on and see how we can actually align the content of this CSS Grid. So inside the grid, we have our content. I'm going to give this grid some height. By default, you will see it works exactly like a block element. Its div takes up the height it needs to display the font and the space, the line height. So if I have no content, you will see it takes up. There's no space. There's no height. I mean, so that's automatic. That's height auto. And if you want to give your grid container a little bit more height than the actual content, we can set some height here just to see some interesting properties. So this is still a little bit big. Let me go to 250. Okay. Now the grid is for 250 pixels. We still have these rows and a single column, and we have the default alignment of this text. Now, if I want to align the content of this grid container either vertically or horizontally in another way than this alignment on the left side, I can use for the horizontal alignment, I can use the justify content, which is exactly the same properties that we use in Flexbox. So by default, the justify content is set to stretch. So take up its row and stretch it horizontally to take up the full space of its row. So this is the default. So whether you type justify content stretch or not, it's exactly the same thing. You can also find out about these default properties if you pick an element and then you go here. So there's no styles applied. So let me go to computed for this element. And let me pull this up. So if I type justify content, so now it's a little bit different. The default value is normal, but straight has the same effect. And you can find like the default values, the computed values as they are called, by just going to this computed panel. These are the styles that are computed by default from the CSS engine. You can override them, of course, by setting your own custom styles. So this is kind of like the default. We see the normal here. So basically, stretch has the same effect, but we also have other abilities such as start. So we can justify the content to the left side of the grid container. So just push them on the left side on the start of this horizontal, let's say, axis, and they take up as much space as they need, as much width as they can take to display their content. So if I put some more text here, you will see that they just get stacked to the left, and they take like the width of the biggest cell in this box. I can also justify them to the end of the grid container horizontally, and I can also justify them to the center. Of course, every single justify content that I put here, you do the cascading effect, it overrides the previous one. So now we just have justify content centered applied. So we have the stretch, which is the default, then we have the start, end on the right, and then center. So this is the horizontal alignment. We also have vertical alignment for the grid content. And for this one, we have to use the align items, which by default, I think it's stretch. And I can go to another one. I can go to start. Okay. Now here's what happens. It's a slightly different case than with the horizontal alignment. You will see, of course, that they changed. And if I highlight this guy here, and you will see that we have still the four columns that are created inside this grid container. So we have the first one, which is starting from line 1 to line 2, these horizontal lines, then one from line 2 to 3. They take up they're like divided equally among the height of the grid container, and the content of each cell is aligned based on the align items, in this case, the start. So you can see that the content, which is basically the text cell 1, is aligned at the start of this row, of this cell, basically. If I put these align items and you will see that they touch the bottom of the cell, so they are aligned at the end of the cell. The content is just pushed to the bottom of the first cell, then the bottom of the second cell, and so forth. And let me see if I have either align items. Let's see, we have center, and start, flex start, and flex end are basically the same for flex. We have some other, these are basically the same. We have the revert, but basically I'm just going to leave it to the simple center and the start, which are usually the ones that we use most of the time. So this is how you align the content either horizontally or vertically inside the grids, rows, and columns. Still, we're having one single column for this grid from lines 1 to 2. So this is how we align the content within the grid. In CSS grid, we have to remember that with CSS grid, a single DOM node is subdivided into rows and columns. So we can see that we have one div. Okay, this is a single node, a single HTML element, but internally it's subdivided into rows and columns. So there's a magic happening whenever we set the display to grid that takes a single element, a single HTML element, and divides it into rows and columns. So that's the magic of CSS grid. We don't have to create more elements to create more rows or more cells. We have this grid happening kind of like internally. And unlike the table layout, for example, in the table layout, whenever you want to create a new row, you have to put a TR element. Whenever you want a new cell, you have to put the TD element. So the table in HTML is it's also kind of like a two-dimensional structure, but you have to use elements specifically, explicitly set the TRs and the TDs that make up the columns and the rows of the table. With CSS Grid, you don't have to use HTML to create, for example, as you will see in a moment, this two-dimensional structure. You can use this. You can create this with CSS, and we can slice it up in any way we wish. And by default, as you saw, CSS Grid uses a single column and will create rows as needed based on the number of children. So these are like the basic kind of like properties that we saw in this case. So let me fork this and move on now to the next step, which is we're going to see the columns. Now I'm going to remove the vertical alignment here, keep it as simple as possible, so this is just like the styling, the basic styling for seeing the grid container and the elements. And now I'm going to take a look at the columns, how we define columns. Yeah, sorry, forgot one thing which is really important. So let me go back to this pen. Now, and this is really a really useful shortcut. In this case, we used the alignment, um, uh, the align items to center things vertically, and the justify content. So I'm going to align items here. I forgot to use the center. So now we also centered the content of each cell vertically. And in this way, when we combine justify content and align items and we use center, we basically have a complete, precise centering of the content of an element, both in vertical and in horizontal axis, which is pretty cool because there are many times in CSS when we want to center things in both of these directions, right? Now, we can use this power of the CSS grid to just center an element. So whenever I have something like this, let me make this section. Let's say, let me give it the border, 1 pixel, solid orange, and some height. So, sorry, some width. And then let me give it a height. And there are times when we want, let's make that a little bit smaller just to fit. Okay, so we have this. And let me like center this like here. So there are many times when you have this kind of like containers or divs or elements, and you want to center the content exactly at the center of the element, meaning horizontally and vertically. And there are all sorts of tricks to do this. But now we saw that if I turn this into a display grid and I center both the horizontal and the vertical axis, I have a really quick way of centering my content with these 3 lines. So if you want to have like some centered content anywhere on your page, just a single thing, a single image, a single text, a single title, or whatever, display grid is a really, really helpful tool. With just 3 lines, you can center the content both horizontally and vertically, which is really, really useful. We can even take it one step further and reduce the number of lines to just 2 lines. And this is by using a shorthand property. So we can combine both justify content and align items in a single command, which is called place items. And basically, place items, let me open up MDN, is a shorthand for justify content and align items. So we can combine these 2 properties together in a single line. You set the align items. I think it's the align items here on the left, and the justify items here on the right. So sorry, this is justify items property, and then you can combine them in one line. So I can go here, and I can say center, and it's going to have the same effect. And I can also go here, and I can say place items center. Now there's a difference between justify content and justify items. I kind of like show you a different property here, but we have the same effect. I can get rid of these 2. So either justify items, either in 2 lines, or I can get rid of this and use place items. So the difference between items, justifying the items and the content, is like items are the single, let's say, elements that are contained within the container, the children, and content is basically CSS looks at the content at the group of items, right? So we have items. We have item 1, 2, 3, 4, like cell 1, cell 2, cell 3, cell 4 in here. So these are the items, and you can justify them. With justified content, you basically group all of them you can think of them as a group of 4 items, and then you can justify them as a group. So that's the kind of the difference here. Okay, so I made this short video to show you the difference between the justify content and align content and the justify items and align items. I'm here in the W3C page, the specification, and you can see here these images, both this one and this one, which kind of like makes the difference a little bit more, make more sense. So as you can see, in the case of justify and align content, we are aligning either horizontally or vertically the full content of the element. For example, the items, all of the items of a CSS grid container. So as you can see here, the alignment works on kind of like the content, like all the items together. And in the case of justify and align items, this works on a per item basis. So as you can see here, the alignment arrows, the vertical and horizontal alignment arrows, are placed inside each cell grid, so inside each item. So it works on a per item basis. Let me show you an example which will make it a little bit more clear. So in this case, I have a section which is a CSS grid container. You can see there's a green border around it. Inside this grid, there are 2 divs, so 2 grid items, hello and world, and they have this kind of like bluish border around them. Now I will enable justify items, align items, and align content and justify content so that you see the difference. But first I'm going to enable the grid helper tool here in the Chrome DevTools. And you can see now the CSS grid, it's made up of 2 cells and 2 rows, and the 2 cells that contain hello and world. Now, if I enable justify content, it will justify, it will align both of these items together, and you can see that now the content is centered in the inside the grid container element. So all of the cells, all of the items are now justified or aligned horizontally at the center. So you can see now both cells take up less space as they are centered within their container. Also, if I use the align content, this will align the content, so both of these cells together on the vertical axis centered. So now the content is placed inside the center of the element, and you can see text up, let's say, or at least visually, it's contained like within the center of the element. Now I will uncheck this, and you will see the difference when I use justify items, and you will see now that each item is centered horizontally inside its cell grid. So now it's this alignment works, or this justify property works on a per item basis. You can see there's a still the area of its cell grid remains the same. It's just that the content of each item is now justified at the center. And also, if I use align, then there will be an align on the vertical axis on each of these item areas. So that's the difference basically. So you can think of them as the justify, or let's say the content, both justify content and align content, working on all of the items as a whole, as a group, whereas the items works on a per item basis. So maybe you can think of it as the content works on this level. So take everything that's inside, and then center it or align it, on these 2 axes. Whereas in the items, we just think on individual, let's say, containers or item containers, and then the alignment happens within these 2, or there might be 4, there might be 8, there might be 10, there might be 100, there might be 1, but you think of as a single item with these two alignment directions. So that's the difference, and I hope it makes more sense now. So in this case, justified items and align items center and place items. So this two-liner is like probably the easiest way to center something inside an element. So that's kind of like the shorthand. And you can either use the two values. If the values are the same, you can just use a single value, both for align items and justify items. But you could, of course, have like something like a different value for the justify items and a different value for the align items. So perhaps we will see the difference between the items and the content in a little bit. But this two-liner is probably the best way to center your elements these days. Now, let me go to the third code pen here, and now I'm going to take a look at the columns. By default, as I mentioned, CSS Grid creates one single column. And if you want to take this grid and split it into two or more columns, you have to explicitly configure this. By default, it doesn't create columns automatically. It creates only rows automatically, as you can see. So if you want to, let's say, make this a two-column grid, we start most of the grid properties are prefixed with grid dash. So you can probably forget that because that's like the default prefix. And then we start to think about like grid. Let me see. We have like grid template. So columns. And this is how you define the columns. So the syntax is basically grid template columns, and then for each of the columns that you want to be created, you have to set the size. So if I want like size column 1 size, column 2 size, and so forth. So basically you have this value separated by spaces. Every value will automatically create a new column on your grid, and that column will have the size that you will define here. So if I want a single column of, let's say, 200 pixels, I will say 200 pixels. Now my grid has one column, still one column, but now the size is set to 200 pixels. I can say 300 pixels and so forth. And if I want like two columns, I will just have to add a separate value, which implies create a second column, which has like 300 pixels as its width. Of course, this can move on, and you create these columns automatically. And of course, you can use different values. So maybe the side ones are like 100 pixels, and this one is slightly larger. And you now see that we have a new structure created. First of all, we have the grid container, still the div that has the class grid that takes up, as you can see, the full width of the container element. It's still a block element. And you can see that the size, like we can see the orange space, which is the margin of this element. And I'm not sure if I can see here like so this is kind of like the main content, the main area of this block element. Okay, it's 988 by 250 pixels. And it's a grid. And the grid now is created inside this container element exactly in the way that we defined. So we have three columns, and they are made up of lines 1 and 2. This one creates this grid track, this vertical grid track, which is basically column 1. Then between lines 2 and 3, we have the second column, and between lines 3 and 4, we have the third column. And now Of course, we have the rows that are created automatically. And as you can see, this is an interesting effect here. We don't have 4 rows as before, okay? Because now we have more space to put these child items. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cells by dividing the grid into a 3 by 2 or 2 by 3 if you count the rows first. We have 6 cells in the grid, and we have 4 elements, so we have more than enough space to put these cells into the available grid areas. So we have just 2 rows because we don't need any more space. And we are left with 2 cells, as you can see here. So by default, when we set the columns, the available items, the available children in the grid will be placed in the available cells. So by default, as you can see, we have the first, the second, the third, the fourth, and so forth. If I were to add another more column, then we would need just 1 row. So if I am to, let's make this 200. Now, as you can see, the second row is gone. We have a 4-column by 1 row grid. So since we have 4 columns, all the items are placed automatically on these cells. So there's no need to create a new row. If I'm going to, I need to place another cell, since there's no space available, it will automatically create another row, and it will place the next item there. You can see here, this creates automatically a new row. Let me see the grid. When you play around, you experiment, and you learn grid, always have this on. And you will see now that the grid is kind of like a grid contained or confined inside the block element with a class grid. So as you can see, the grid here, it stays here on the left side because we have explicitly set the cell size. So it's kind of like the grid, the actual grid is smaller than the actual container content. Now, if I want to have the cells or the contents inside the cells take instead of having to define the pixels, and maybe this can, like, be responsive. If I don't want to explicitly set the width of these columns, I can use the fractional unit. So instead of saying or setting explicitly the width, I can say take the width, like the full width. These are fractions, meaning they divide basically the available width by these fractions. This is the full width divided by 4. We have 4 fractions, okay, which make up the full width. So we have 4 fractions, and automatically the browser calculates the width for each of these cells. We don't have to say, okay, 200 pixels or whatever. What is the width of the grid? It's 1000. Let me set the grid to something like, to be a little bit. So now the grid is 1000 pixels. We have 4 fractions, which mean we have to divide, or actually the browser divides this grid by 4. 1000 divided by 4 is 250 pixels. So these are now, as you can see, 250 pixels. So the fraction is actually a pretty cool way of splitting the grid and taking up as much space as you need without having to worry about the calculation of the width. Of course, there might be cases when you want to set this width explicitly, but usually we work with fractional units in CSS Grid. Now, fractions are not only limited to just 1, the value 1. We can actually have a column take up more fractions from the available width. So in this case, we have 1000 pixel. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. So we count the numbers before the fraction. So we have 4, that's the fractions. And we end up dividing by 4. And this is how we get to 4 columns of 250 pixels each. Now, if I want, for example, this cell 2 to be slightly larger than the other cells, and in terms of fractions instead of pixels, I can say I want you like to take this one and give it 2 fractions. So the calculations that happens here is take up 1000 pixels. We have how many fractions do we have in total? 1, 3, 4, 5. So we have 5, then 1000 pixels and 5. But now it doesn't only calculate or divide by 5 because we have like to so this is 200 pixels, right? And so let me go and see now that we have like so it divides 1000 pixels by 5. So we need the fractions, each fraction to be 200 pixels each, okay, since we divide by 5. And now each column gets the number of fractions multiplied by this fractional size. So 1 time 200 is 200 pixels. This one is 2 times 2 the fractional width, so it's 400, and the rest are 200. So this fractional also allows us to do this kind of like layouts where we give a certain column or columns a little bit more width based on kind of like a more relative, let's say, unit, instead of having to calculate ourselves, what's the width, let's divide and do all this stuff either in our head or using a calculator. So this is the fractional unit, which is really, really cool. And let me see if there are any questions, or I can see whether I have other things to say. Okay, I have a few more things. Now, apart from the fractional unit, I can use auto. So I will use auto now for 3 columns. So this just gives like creates 3 columns, of course, and automatically applies the width to these cells. But this is not the same as the fractional unit. So let me see whether I can have an example here. Okay. Okay, I think I have to make this responsive. Let me see whether I can. Okay. Okay, I'll come up with an example. Let me move this up here. So we have auto. It's slightly different. I will see whether I can find an example in a bit. And now, whenever we have like this, like let's say this, let's take this grid column setup, where we have like some fractions repeated over a couple of times. So instead of writing this one fraction, one fraction, one fraction, we have a shorthand. We have kind of like a utility function in CSS. And instead of saying one fraction 4 times, we can use the repeat function, which is actually pretty cool because it's a function we use using functions in programming languages. But we have this repeat, which takes up the number of times and the size. So basically, this is the syntax, which means it's going to repeat the size that we're going to give it as a second parameter a number of times. So if I want to do this using the repeat, I would say grid template columns repeat Now I want 4 times 4 columns, which will have the size one fraction. So exactly the same result. I can like yeah. Let me put this here so you can see now. This is the 200. With a repeat, I get the same result as this one, and instead of writing this 1FR, 1FR. And of course, I can come up with something like, if I want to recreate this one, I can say the first column will be 1FR, then next one will be 2FR, and I think I can write this. Okay, so I can rewrite this one by defining the first column size, the second one, which is different, so I cannot use repeat here. Then I can use repeat for the last 2 columns. So 1 fraction, 2 fractions, and then um, uh, 2 times the 2 fractions. So you can use the repeat interchangeably. You don't have to use it just as a single statement here. So this is kind of like the repeat function, which is of course really useful when you have like lots and lots of columns. One example that I have here is, for example, a calendar. In a calendar, we have to repeat this, 7 times. So instead of having to write 1FR 7 times, you can use this repeat, which is really, really handy. So this is the repeat. Let me see. And now let's go to the rows. Okay, so columns. Let's see how we can set. Okay, but before I go to the columns, let me recreate a tic-tac-toe board using what we have learned so far. So tic-tac-toe board is, of course, this this game. So I want to create a 3x3 grid where I can place these cells, and then we can put this X and O. So how we create this? Let me create this below, or let me create this like this here. So item. So this will be tick, and we need like of course 9 elements. So item times 9, and then let's put an X for now, and we'll see how we can. So we have to create the content for the cells here. So we have the X or the O, or whatever. And let's see how we can create this and make this a tic-tac-toe board with CSS Grid and just a few commands. So first is I'm going to outline this to see the borders, the boundaries. Now, usually, it's okay. Yeah. Usually we want to like restrict the width of the tic-tac board. So this is like way too big for the screen. So I will give it a width of, let's say, 300 pixels. Actually, and of course, since the tic-tac-toe it's kind of like a rectangular, a square, I will give it the same height. As you can see now, there's some overflowing. Let me temporarily hide the grid so we can see just the board. So you can see here like there's a green border, and the space is not enough to contain this element. So the content overflows. Okay, but we're going to fix this with grid. Now I want to switch to a two-dimensional grid. So I will say display grid. And how many columns do I need? I need 3 columns for the tic-tac-toe. So grid, template, columns. And now I can use the FR So this will divide the 300 pixel and will give its box one fraction of 1/3. So 300 pixels divided by 3 gives me 100 pixels. So this should be 100 pixels. The height is also 300, so I get the advantage of having these full squares here make up the tic-tac-toe. And now I can use the trick that I learned before to center the elements at its box here. So now it's a time to use the tick item. The tip was, if you want to center the items of an element, basically you set the display to grid, and then there's this one-liners which is going to center, and I can maybe set the font family to Arial or sans serif just to have a little bit more of a game looking. So look how easy it is to create like this kind of like layouts with grid. We have display grid, we have these functional units which we can write it really easily like this. And then we use also two lines the center to center the child items content, which is pretty cool. Of course, now we can just move this box, move this container around as we would with like a normal block element. So I would say margin, auto, and then maybe give it a margin like this. So really cool things that you can do this. And I think if you try this, is a good exercise to try this with Flexbox and see how much more you need to invest in like laying this out, many more lines, and probably it's going to be a little bit harder. But with grid, we have the ability. So that's one practical example of how we can use grid. Let me see what else I have for this. Okay, let me go now to the rows. So remember that by default, the CSS grid creates one single column. If you want to define your own like a custom number of columns, you have to define them. But the columns are automatically created by the CSS grid itself based on the space that is required to put the elements. If there's a single column, there will be a single row for each element. If we have more columns, CSS will just put its element in an available cell, and then it will create more rows if there's no available space. So in here, if I create another div, it will just create another row, put the element in the first cell, because remember, even though we see like a space here, this guy here is now a 3x4 grid. So the next element will be put on the next row on the first cell. Okay, and we have two cells left. So this is automatically created using a new element. So I will leave this commented. And by default, we can see that these rows are automatically like divided based on the height. So there's a 300 pixel height. There are 3 rows. So CSS divides and its row, and when we have like one row take 100 pixels, the next one 100 pixels, and so forth. But we can also do some cool things. Let me not break this layout for now. Let me just change the other one. So in here we have like a height of 200 pixel. Let me just comment this. So now we have height auto. So just give each row the height that needs to display the content, but we can customize the row height by using the grid row grid template row. And now we use exactly the same syntax. So row one size, row two size, and so forth. So that's the syntax. Define the row size for one or more rows. So I will say grid template row 100, 100 pixel. Um, is it? I think it's rows. Yep. Sorry, it's rows. Columns and rows always plural because we. Now here's the interesting part. We have defined a custom height for the first row. Okay. So this doesn't create the rows. These rows are created automatically because there's a need for space, okay, to place the items. So this just defines the size. In the column, you remember when we used grid template columns, we define whether there will exist a second, a third, and fourth column. So grid template columns also create columns and sets the sizes. Okay, with rows, with template rows, we set like the size, but they're automatically created if there's some space needed. So this doesn't restrict the grid to just one row, even though I just defined one single row size. It will automatically create a new row or more rows if it needs to put if it needs more space to put the elements. So this defines the height for the first row. If I put another one, it will define the height for the second row. And for the rest of the rows, it will automatically, it will use the auto. It will, if I haven't defined the height for the third row, it will just, it will not be there. It will not create this extra row. And so this will create a row. But if it needs to automatically create a row, so this is explicitly saying to the grid, I want 3 rows. Let's make this 50 pixel. If I don't explicitly set a third or a fourth row, if the grid needs more space, more rows to put the content, it will actually create automatically. Let me see. It needs 2 more cells, so it has to create a third row. So now I can only I only explicitly define the height for the first column, so the first row, the height for the second row, and the third one, because I hadn't explicitly set the height, but also like the creation of this row, it will automatically set the height to auto. So take up as space as you need for this row. And the more I add, the more rows I add, or the more rows CSS grid adds, we still have defined only the first and the second row. The third, the fourth, the fifth, blah, 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 we have set the height to auto, which might not be what we want. So if we don't know exactly how many rows will be created, because, okay, this is hard-coded, but what if we have some data that we're fetching from the server and the table can have like from 1 row to 1,000? We don't know how many like rows will be created. So in this case, I can okay, I can go and write 100 pixels, blah blah blah, or repeat and so forth. But if this number of rows is dynamic, I can use the grid auto rows, which basically let me put like I don't know, 70 pixel, which basically says that for any rows created automatically, set the height to. So in here, I explicitly set the number of rows and their height. Okay. And in here, I set the height for any rows that will be added automatically, whether it's 1 or 200 rows. So if I want like some custom size, I can just use auto rows. In this case, because most of the times in the tables we need some consistent layout view, we don't want like the first row to have like 100 pixels and the second one 50 pixels and the others 70 pixels. We can probably get rid of this and say, okay, just have grid auto rows for all the rows 70 pixels. So we have a consistent, let's say, height. But there might be cases when you want to have a different row height for the first or the second. For example, maybe this is the header row, maybe this is the footer row. I don't know, or maybe these are some metadata. So you can use both. And we now have concluded the basic way that we can split an element into cells, into like columns and rows, and then we can create these multi-dimensional tables. And inside these multi-dimensional tables, let me once again highlight this one. We can place these elements, this content in any way we like. We will see in a bit the part that I said any way we like, but now you can see that they all take up one cell. Um, so this concludes like the columns and the rows. Let me see, have any more things to add. Mm, Okay, let's go one step further and see how, instead of just confine ourselves to a single cell or some content be placed inside a single cell, we can make the content take up as much space as we want. So let me fork this and go into the fourth step. I will get rid of like some of these extra cells and the tic-tac-toe for now. And let me go here. Let's get rid of these. Okay, and let's come up with some, I don't know, a little bit simpler. Let's get 3 columns. And let me move this here so we can. So let me just give it an automatic height of 100 pixels. And I will not set or define a height for this grid so that it expands. Okay, we have now 3 columns and 2 rows. Because we have like this, I open up the grid diagram through the helper panel here. So now let's say that I want to create like a very custom layout where we can place the content in any way we like. So let me see. For example, let's say that I wanted, like I have like cell 2. So, and I want cell 2 to, instead of just taking like this cell, I want it to span like this area of the grid. I can do that. Or maybe I want cell 1 to like take up like this space. Or maybe I want some cell to span like this. So basically, based on the available area that we have, and basically based on the grid, on this 2-dimensional grid, we can place the content in any way we like. So we can make some div or some element take up as many cells as we want. So here's how we can customize these cells, one or more of these cells, to take up as much space as we want. So in this case, let's say that I want cell 2 to take up 2 columns. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is you want to come up with a simple like 2-dimensional table, open the grid, and take a look at the lines that make up the different cells, because they will help us decide and define our cell boundaries. So in this case, I can see that each cell is kind of like defined by four numbers. The first one is defined by the line, the row start line, which is 1. So this is the line 1 on the vertical axis, and the width is defined by the second line, line 2. So we have um, 1 to 2, and also sorry, this is the column. So this is the line that defines the column, where it starts and where it ends. And we also have these two lines, line 1 and line 2, which define the row or the height of this or the placement, the vertical placement of this cell in this grid. So these are the two, that let's say the four coordinates. The line start, the column line start, the column line end, so the number 1 and number 2, the row um, uh, uh, number, the start, the row start number, which is 1 also, and then the row end number, which is 2. Similarly, for this, let's say for cell 5, we have let's start from the row. So it starts from row 2. So this is the row start. It ends on 3, on row and 3, and then on the column it starts from 2 and it ends on line 3. So row numbers and column numbers, line numbers make up kind of like the define like the space and the area of each cell. So by default, we have like one by one. Okay, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4. Now, if I want a cell like this to take up more space, then I will have to work with the numbers available to me. So if I want this cell to span this much like width in terms of column, I have to find where the column starts and where the column ends. So if I want to make this to go from 2 to 3, I go to 4, I will have to define the column start to 2 and the column end to 4. So this will be 2 to 4, from 2 to 3. Okay, so I will go to this. And if I also wanted to make this span like 2 rows, I would have to go from this is like, it starts from 1 to 2. So now it's 1 to 2. Okay, I would have to go from 1 to 3. So you see the grid, you see the numbers, you kind of like draw in this case, or you can like imagine where your cell is going to be placed, and then you will use these numbers to actually define the new area, the new area for this element. Now, in order to do this, I have to get cell 2, and let me give this an ID. So I will have to give to go here, and let's start with the first case, which is make it span like 2 columns. So just expand this cell horizontally, okay, to kind of like take up the space of cell 3. Then we'll try out to span 2 rows. So the other one would be that we're going to try is just make it span 2 rows. Okay, and then we'll also try to make it span like 2 rows and 2 columns. And we'll see how this is done using some nice property. Span 2 rows and 2 columns. Now, once again, we have to pay attention to the numbers, which, okay, we can probably imagine the numbers like a vertical line number 1, 2, 3, 4, but I think it helps to just actually see the numbers. So go here. So the first one means that we have to make the cell start from row uh, from row 1. So row, let me just put this in comment for now. row starts 1, and it will still span like one row, so it will end on row end 2. Okay, so this space, and then horizontally we want to go from column start 2, and instead of ending as it is right now on 3 on this vertical line, it will end at 4. So we kind of like visualize the grid using the helper tools, and then we kind of like plan the way that we're going to want to expand this based on these numbers. So we start with, let me just get rid of this. And for this one, I'm now inside the cell, right? I'm not defining a grid container property, but I'm defining a grid item property. So now this is a child of grid. So I'm inside this 2, and I'm going to say grid row start. So it's 1. Sorry, it's 1. Yes. So 1 grid row end. Now I'm going to switch from 2, which is the default, to 3. Sorry. This is just spanning 2 columns. So the row end will still be 2. So going from here to here, and then this is where things start to change. Column start, it's going to be 2. This is the same, but the grid column end will not be 3. It will be 4. So let's see what happens now. Let's see if it's. So let me put this background orange. Okay. So now we have a new expansion, let's say, of this cell. So from here, from 1 to 2, and from 2 to 3, we went from 2 to 4. Now this cell expanded to take up the area, the grid area that I defined through these 4 coordinates. You can think of this as an X and Y, and automatically the cell 3 is pushed onto the next available cell. So there's no space for cell 3 here. It automatically gets pushed or wrapped on the next cell, which subsequently pushes cell 4 to the right, which subsequently pushes cell 5. So that's how we can like define and place a cell anywhere we want in the grid. We have the coordinates, these, let's say, X and Y coordinates, if you will, or the line numbers. It's actually a little bit different, but and then we can move it. So this is how we can move this cell span like 2 columns. Let me go back to the initial. So the original coordinates are 1 to 2 vertically and 2 to 3, and then I can go here. If I change the column start to 1, it will span the whole row. So this is how we define. Let me also conclude by making this span V. So let me just put them here. So let me. So now I'm going to reset this back to the original coordinates, which is 2 to 3. Okay, sorry, it's 2 to 3. So that's the original. Now, if I want this to span 2 rows, I will have to change the row end, which now stops on the horizontal line 2, and I will have to move it to horizontal line 3. So if I change this to 3, now the cell spans like 2 rows. Cell 3 remains in position because there's still space for it. It doesn't have to move. But cell 5, which was right here, has to move to the right. So this new cell pushes the cell 5 to the right. So you have to take this into consideration. And lastly, let's move this to span 2 rows and 2 columns. So once again, I'm going to reset this so we can see. So 2 to 3 and 1 to 2. So now line 1, line 2, column line 2, column line 3. So I have to expand this. So it takes up 2 rows. So row end will become 3. I have to expand it horizontally to end up on the column line number 4. And as you can see, CS Grid automatically expands because it needs space to move the cell 3, cell 4, and cell 5. So it creates another row. Cell 3 remains here, but cell 4 is pushed here, cell 5 here. So this is how we can like position any the content in any place we want inside this two-dimensional grid. We have to think in terms of these cells. Okay, these are the available boxes that we can actually let's say paint content, if you will. So we can paint something. We can paint something here. We can paint something. Let's say here, and so forth. But of course, we cannot like do something like create something like here. If I wanted something like this, I would have to subdivide into more columns. So I would have to put more columns like this, and then create, let's say, something here. So you can subdivide the grid in any ways you want, as many columns and as many rows as you want to place your elements. So this is the space of the container, the content area. Okay, so this is the content area, the blue area of the div with class grid. So it's not padding. As you can see, padding is 0, as is border. We have a margin. So this is like the main area. So it's not padding. Otherwise, we would see the green. Padding is always the green. Border is this orange, and margin is the no, padding is, I think, like slightly yellowish. And then we have margins. So this is just the content. But if you define within this content, within this block element, which has now a width of 1000 pixels, if you define the grid to take up as less space as you need, it will just be confined to that space. So the grid kind of like lives or is contained within the overall area of the grid. So we can see here the outline. This defines the area of the div. This is the subgrid, which basically is used to take up the content and lay it out in a way that we want. But there's still this space available. Kind of like when you buy an area with this, I don't know, 200 meters by 200 meters, and you decide to build your building on only one part of the area. Okay, so this is how the grid works. We just rent a place. We just rent like this huge area, the div, the block element, and we decide to put or move the CSS grid just one part of this whole area and build our content or move our content or display our content just in that part. But the rest is still, as you can see here, available. The cell grid can expand and take up this area. So that's just the content area of the div with class grid, the grid container. And whenever you come across this like this situation where there's some space or something that you don't know exactly, or some area that you don't know exactly what it's made up of, you open up the Compute, you select the element, and then you move over this box model, kind of like utility, and you can see whether it has a margin, 32 pixels, no border, padding, and so forth. Let's move forward and see what else I have to show about. So we saw how we can place these cells by using these 4 coordinates. So let me just switch back to this one. And let me switch back to the fractional unit, so they are like equally divided. Okay. Now, this is a little bit too verbose, or if this is a little bit too verbose for you, I highly recommend that you start with this syntax, like explicitly define the start, the end of the row, the column start and the column end, because it's easier like to sit in the grid and define the points. But if you get used to this, like to this way of placing your cells, there are much easier ways to define these numbers. So instead of writing 4 lines, we can use grid row and use this syntax to define the start and the end. So this is grid row start end, which of course can go up to 3, 4, and so forth. So I'm keeping this exactly like here. So grid row combines both the start and the end of the grid row, and we have the grid column, which is a shorthand for grid column start and grid column end. So this is grid column start end. And instead of 4 lines, you can use like 2 lines. So this is just a shorthand for this one. If you're learning CSS Flexbox or CSS Grid, I highly recommend that you start with the full, like the basic commands, like these 4 commands, and only resort to shorthands if you're comfortable and you have mastered like the basic commands. Because the main reason is because you have more things to remember, which is hard because CSS Flexbox and Grid have a lot of commands, a lot of properties. So there will be a lot more things for you to remember, and it's also confusing. So, okay, how do I define the grid row start? Is it grid row or grid row start, and so forth? So just start and stick with these commands and use these shorthands only after a while, after you have mastered. So I will show the shorthands just so you know them, but I would say stick with these ones, which are relatively easier to start with. And the last one is we can have like grid area, which I believe is row start. Let me go to MDN because also I CSS grid area. So grid area is a shorthand property for row start, row end, column end. Okay. So we have row start, column start, if I remember, row end, and column end. So let's see if we're going to be recreating the same with 1 line. So grid area, the row start is 1, the column start is 2, the row end is 2, and the column end is 4. So I got it right. If I want to change this to take up like 2 columns, then I will have to change the row ends to 3. So same thing with just 1 line. Personally, I remember these guys. I use this rarely, but feel free to test them and experiment once you have mastered. But in the beginning, I find it way more easy to work and just remember 4 properties instead of 7 in this case. Okay, this is one way that we can place the content and make it span any like part of the grid. Of course, I can do this for another one. So this is cell 3. Let's try this out. one more example. Let me show the, okay. So let's say I want this to span, okay, let's say I want this to take up like, I don't know, this area. So I will start from 2, 3, 4. So row start and row end would be 2, 4. And then it's going to be 1, all the way 2, 3. So 2, 4, 1, 3. Let's see if I can manage this. So grid area, or let's say grid row 1, sorry, it was 2, 4. And then the grid column, it was like 1 up to 4, I guess, I think, or 3. I think I wanted to, okay. Let me give it a background green. So now cell 5 takes up these 4 cell grids. I use the shortcut, so from 2 to 4, from 1 to 3, and then the cell 3 and cell 4, of course, are like pushed to the side. Now, just to make use, before we jump on to the next really cool way to place the cell grids, let me use the negative numbers. So in this case, I have, or I think, okay, I have like, let me write them here. And then I will say start is 2, and then end is 4. So we can keep them. And then we have end is 1 and 3. Okay, what if I wanted to start from the end, like either from the bottom or from the right? So in the case of the columns, which is easier, we start from -1, and then we go to -2, -3, -4. So instead of starting from 1 and going up to 3, in this case, I would start counting from the right. So -1, -2. So this is where we're going to end. And then -2, -3, -4. So I can use, I can start counting from the right, and I can use -4 as the start. You can see the number here, and then end on -2. So remember, this is -1, -2, -3, -4. So start here, end here, but count like backwards. And I can do the same thing by counting from the bottom to the top, which is -1, and then we go to -2, -3. So this would be here. Let me go to the grid. Grid row. So that would be -3. It's a little bit difficult to think this way, but as you can see, I've made a mistake. So not exactly -1, -2, -3, and then we draw start. So let me see, grid row. Okay, -1, -2, -3. Okay, that's because basically now I've modified the grid, so it start counting from the initial like grid. So it's a little bit hard now to see where's my mistake. So on 2, I can start from -2 to minus 4. Forward. Okay, I messed this up. I have to, let's say, go back to the grid. So I have a -1 and then -2, -3. So I'm not sure how I should. Okay, it's okay. That's a little bit tough at this point because I have already changed the grid area. I'm missing something here. Anyway, I will leave this up to you. I think it's a good challenge. So I managed to make the grid column work. My calculations failed on the rows. So calculate, and use negative values here. So you can practice by finding out the right rows and columns based on the reverse order. So I will leave this to you as a challenge because I want to move on to one really cool feature of CSS Grid, and especially a way to define, to place the elements in a way that's way more intuitive. So let me, okay, I will change the layout so I no longer need this. So I will come up with another layout. Let me. So suppose I wanted to create a layout that looks like this. So I have a header, I have like a sidebar, I have some main area, and I have a footer. Okay, and this can get as complicated as we want. I can have like, I don't know, a grid here and a subgrid here, and I don't know, things here. Basically, CSS Grid is great for these cases. But I will start with a simple one. So I have this layout, kind of like the normal like layout where you have a header, a footer, a main area, and a sidebar. Okay. So let's think in terms of a grid. So first of all, we have to count the lines, like the maximum number of lines that we have in each column or in each direction, horizontal and vertical, so that we come up with the grid that we need. So in this case, for example, if I like make the line, even though there will be no divide the content in the header in the footer, I expand the line that crosses here, so to come up with the final setup of the grid, which means if I want to create this layout, and just because this part, this row is split into two columns, I will definitely need two columns in the grid. So you have to find out the dimensions of the grid by looking at, let's say, the part of the layout that has kind of like the maximum, let's say, parts. In this case, is this one. So I definitely need at least two columns to create this layout. And of course, I need 1, 2, 3 rows to get the content. If I wanted to add like a sidebar here, maybe a smaller sidebar, then I would have to kind of like think of it like this. So I would definitely need another column. So the first, let's say, the challenge is to kind of like see, watch carefully your layout or the design or the mockup or whatever you have to like to convert into code, and think of how the subgrid or the grid would be kind of like defined in terms of rows and columns. So in this case, I just won't go into this case. I will go into this just 2 by 3. So in here, I want like 2 columns and 3 rows. Okay, what else do I need? I see that in terms of like height, well, if I think in terms of like fractional units, I would say, let's say, maybe this is one fraction and this is another fraction, and this is maybe, if I think in terms of like a total of 10 fractions, this takes up roughly 80%. So I could say I could use fractions to kind of like set the height. We will see how we can customize this. Um, and then of course the columns are going to be defined accordingly. So this is, let's say, roughly 80%. Yeah, maybe 80% here and 20% here. We'll see. So we can have like 2 fractions here and 8 fractions here, something like this. Let's see. We'll test it out. So the columns would be 2 FR and 8 FR. And the rows, we'll test this out. Maybe we can use some other units. So 8 FR and 1 FR. So once you get your columns and your rows and roughly your size, you can start by defining the grid inside a grid container. So in this case, I will have of course, a grid container, and I will have like one element, the header, a sidebar, a main content, and a footer. So 4 elements in total, but still the grid will be divided in 2 by 3. So we're going to have like six cells, and we're just going to place these elements in these cells according to the layout that we see here. So 4 elements, and then we're going to use this layout sketch to build this. Okay, now I have to delete this, unfortunately, but I think so. Grid container. Let's make it a section. Okay, where is it? The worker section. Grid container. Okay, it seems to have stuck. So class equals grid container. Something is happening with an unexpected character. What is happening here? Section. Let me refresh. I think there's a bug. Okay, and I need a header. I need a sidebar. So I'm going to use the side. I need the main content, main, and I need the footer. I always start by applying some outlines just to see the areas. So outline 1 pixel solid orange, and then some other outline for the children. And let's make this like, okay, let's just give it a margin so we can see like the, just to see the margin 1 rem, and then just to see the outline. So I have this setup, and now I will see that it's still a normal block element and it's not defined as a grid. So let me say display grid. It becomes a grid. Okay. And now I will set the columns. So grid prefix, then template, and then columns. I said it would be 2FR and 8FR, so that we have like this kind of like more space to the right than to the left. And for the rows, grid, template, rows, now I have to give this some height. So let me give this this grid container a height. Let's make this 100% of the viewport height. So let's We'll see. Um, Now it expands because I have the margin. So let me make this for now a little bit smaller. Okay. In a real situation, you would get rid of the margin, and then you would probably set it to 100 viewport height so that it takes up the whole. Okay. We see everything looks okay. Um, we will set the grid template rows in a bit. For now, I want to make sure that the header takes up two columns. Okay, according to the layout. Then on the second row, the aside will be on the left, and then the footer would be on the right. So this would be like kind of like this must become the header. So no aside, just the header. Then in here there will be the sidebar and the main here, and then the footer would be pushed on the next row, spanning both columns. So this would be the footer. This would be the header. So full width on the header and the footer, and just split the side and the main in a single row in two parts on the left side, on the right side. So this is what I want to accomplish, which means that I need to define some kind of like layout for these elements. Let me before I go into like the more advanced like or the cooler way to define this layout, let me come up with kind of a different kind of like way. So I can get the header, and I can use the grid row start and column blah 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 to make sure that the header spans this area, these two columns at the top. Okay, and I can do that, but I can also set the columns. So I can say start from 1 and then to 3. So the header takes up like grid columns, header. Let me see, background orange, grid columns. Okay, 1, 2, 3. I'm missing something here. Oh, it's column. It's singular. This gets me all the time. So I can do it like this. Okay, and then I can do the same for the footer. So now they both will span, as you can see, two columns, sorry. So this means pushing the side and the main, the middle row, and we can do that. I can also use another syntax. I also encourage you to keep with the 4 ones that we saw earlier, row start, row end, column start, column end. This is another shorthand, but I want to cover this. So I can say grid column, and the footer, I want it to span two columns. So instead of defining the start and the ending line, I can say span two, meaning two columns. And I can do the same thing for here. So grid column, singular. This gets me all the time. So that's yet another way. Okay. And maybe I can give a little bit more fractions here. So kind of like 30, 70%. So two ways to come up with this layout. But I want to show you like a now like much cooler way of defining this layout. So this is kind of like the simple way. We leave that. And now in here, I am going to use something that it's called grid template areas. I believe I always have a hard time remembering like the plural in this properties. So here's how this works. So basically, you kind of like sketch out the layout, the grid. So remember, we have like this kind of like grid. And we will define this area, these 2 by 3 area in a really nice, like intuitive way. And then you start thinking about where each of these elements belong in which parts. So basically, you say, okay, the header, okay, which parts of this grid does it take up? Let me use a different color to make it easier. So this guy here will take up this space of the available grid. Now, the side will take up this space. The main, let's give it another color, will take up this space. And let's say the footer will take up this space. So first you come up with a grid, which is crucial, like the two-dimensional or three-dimensional, sorry, two-dimensional, meaning with 2 columns and 3 rows in here, or as many rows as columns as you need. And then try to think of where those elements that you have fit into this grid, like exactly how you would position, how you would log them in this case. And based on this kind of like diagram, you go here and you define these rows and columns in this way. So basically, I start by defining the rows, and I can say, let's say area, let's say column 1, column 2, column 1, column 2, column 1, column 2. So basically, for every row, you use a string, and for every column, you use some kind of a word in here. It can be anything, okay? Whatever. So basically, you define your grid layout, not this colored one, the positioned elements, but your grid layout in a way that is every row is defined like this on a new line in double quotes. Okay, and every column is defined in this way. So you just use this kind of like weird looking at first string formatting. At least in CSS, it's quite the first time that we see this kind of syntax, but it lets you kind of like go from your sketch, from your grid, and create this two-dimensional table in exactly the same way as you see it on the diagram. So the rows are defined like this, and the columns are defined like this. So first, you come up with this layout. Let's see if, okay, in here we see like the layout. We have 2 columns and 3 rows. Okay. Next, what you do is you say, okay, how much of this available grid is the header element, or any element, or any child of your grid container is going to take? It's going to take the top 2 top 2 columns. So these 2 columns in the first row will be attributed to the header. So now, instead of column 1 and column 2, I give a name that I'm going to use for the part that it's going to be placed on at the top. So I'm going to use header, but you can use any name, okay? Or let me name it. I don't know. No, let me name it header. So now, in your grid that you have defined in this way, you start placing, let's say, a code word for your elements, for this element. Now, let's go to the next row. This row is made up of the aside element and the main element. So in here, I will use a custom name, sidebar, and this will be like, let's say, content. Okay, so I have 2 elements. So this is placed here. So I'm going to use sidebar. And then this column should be the space for the main element. And the footer takes up the 2 columns at the bottom row. So I will say footer or foot or whatever. Now, of course, you have to pick names that correspond to the actual elements that you're going to put there. So this is kind of like the grid templates areas, like sketching out and implementation. You kind of like visualize your final grid, the number of rows and columns you need. Then you think where in this grid you will have to place these elements that are contained with this grid container, and you place them by putting words that correspond to that particular element. So you can see here that the two columns of the first row of the upper row are both applied or used by the header, by this one element that I call header. On the second row, the first column is taken up by this sidebar thing, then the content, and then the foot. Okay, so now this is how you define your grid in this string kind of like syntax, and then how you place your elements inside. So it's just like this diagram. And now, since you have your layout, so basically you set up your grid layout, and you have kind of like put a name on the columns and the rows. So this is like first defining the grid, and then saying that this is going to be taken up by a thing called header. This is going to be taken up by something that I will call sidebar. This by something that it's called content, and this by something that it's called footer, and also footer. Okay, and since we're using the same name here, it makes sense for grid to see this as one element, this as another element, and this as another element, and this as one element, because they have the same name. So two columns that belong to the same element, so they will be sharing this space. So on top of the grid, you just defined, you put these labels, and you define the placement or the positioning of some elements. And these are just code words, okay? This can be anything, anything you want. But for me, it makes sense to make them closely resemble the actual elements or the actual role of the element or the content. So now this is the first part. And then I go here, and for each of these elements that need to be positioned on the grid, I create a selector. So I need a selector for every one of them, and the footer. And now, according to the grid template areas, let me just put this here. I will use the name. I will pick the name that I used for this, to define these template areas and the positioning of some elements, and I will use the name in each of these elements. So I will say grid area header, grid area sidebar, grid area content, and grid area foot. So now CSS knows that you need a 2 columns by 3 rows grid, so it creates it. You put these stamps, these labels on the columns, and then as you apply these names in each of these elements using the grid area, it takes each of these elements and places them on the grid, on this grid, according to the name. So the header element will span these 2 columns in the first row. The side will be placed here. The main will be placed here, and the footer will be placed here. So basically, it's like sketching out a map and then saying, I'm going to put this here, I'm going to put this here, and then CSS Grid automatically picks up any element that you want and puts that in the place. Now, here's the cool thing. If I wanted to place the footer in the header on the top and the header on the bottom, so if I wanted in this grid this element to be on the top and this element to be at the bottom, I could just go here and say, okay, put this in the foot area and put this in the header area. Okay. Or if I still use the foot, you will see that both elements coincide. They are placed on the same grid area. So you can see here footer and header. But just by changing the grid area label, they're automatically placed anywhere you want on your grid, no matter the order in which you define them here. So you can see here that we define the header here and the footer at the bottom of the HTML, but CSS disregards this order and just sees the template areas and their name, so that you can place them any way you like. Now I can go one step further and create another row, another column. So I can go here and say, what if I had a 3 by 3? So then I could go and put header here, 2 columns for the content, and 3 for the. So now my grid is. Let me refresh, because I think we should be seeing. So let me see. Okay. Grid template areas. Okay, we have. Oh, I forgot. Here, let me use 3 fractional units. Okay, I have to set the column. Okay, now I think we can see it more clearly. So when you add columns, you of course have to define the columns in here. So if I go here, so now I have like 3 columns. So I have to put 3 words in here, 3 words in each row, since I have 3 column layout. I still get the same visual output, but now I have more space and like more flexibility to move things around. For example, maybe I want the main to take up, I don't know, like 2 columns or maybe more, or maybe the header can take up like, I don't know, for some reason, 2 columns. Now, if I want, for example, the footer, which or let's make the header, let's give it background. So, okay, let me put them just back as they were, because it doesn't make sense. Okay, so now what if I wanted the header to take up like 2 columns and leave this column space empty, but still have the side and the main on the next row? So if I wanted this to be just empty, I didn't want the header to take up the 3rd column, I can just replace this with a dot. So now there are still 3 columns with 3 fractional units, 1 fractional unit each, but this one just takes up these first 2 columns, which is really handy. I can make it take 1 column, or I can move this to the right. So you can move things around, which is pretty cool. Again, I don't know, leave this empty. Let's give it a background just to see the main. And you can use all sorts of like tricks to place. And here, I don't know, I'll try to put this in the middle. Yeah, now it breaks, but so don't do this, but I can put this, or maybe put this here. Of course, the layout has to make sense. Okay, if I try to split an element into 2, it won't work. So that's kind of like the grid template areas, which is actually one of the most advanced ways to define, layouts, especially 2-dimensional layouts. So if you have a layout, if you have design, you can just take the design, sketch out the rows and the columns using this way, which is pretty easy, rather than thinking in start line, row line, and so forth. Then place everything in any way you want. Let me add one more row. So just to see. So now I have one more row with two columns, and the footer now spans like two rows. So you can do some really cool stuff. So this is for the grid template areas. Let me see, have something else to conclude. Okay, and last but not least, and we're going to conclude with this bit of extra time, but I think it's really useful. I'm going to I have like a extra comment, so I'm going to just revert back to the kind of like basic layout. Okay, header, and then I want to make this, and let's make this like okay. And now I want to make this responsive. So let's take a look at how easy it is to make responsive layouts with CSS Grid, and especially the grid template areas. So here's the idea. When I have like desktop or have a lot of space on my screen, I can have this layout. Okay, but if I go into like a mobile or maybe a tablet, it makes sense to kind of like come up with something like this. So have like the sidebar here, the side here, and the main here, and of course the footer and the header. Okay, because if this like turns out to become like something like this, I mean, you need more space on your mobile phone to see the main content, the side. So it makes sense to use a different layout when you change the screen size. So let's say that we want to go from this one to this one. So once again, you can think of a grid area, a grid placement, and you can use the media queries to switch to this layout once the screen size is kind of like less than or greater than some kind of width. So let me see if I can sketch out this grid template area. So I will say if media width is less than, I don't know, 500 pixels. So that's a media query that's going to enable these CSS rules once the width of the screen gets less than 500 pixels. So let me just change the background color to see whether that works. So if this gets to 500 pixels, it becomes red. Okay. So this is just an indicator that the media query works. So now when I get here, I want to change this layout. So I'm just going to define a completely different grid area. This is easy to do because I can also see the layout. So I will say that when let's make this grid container in case we have other. So in here, I'm going to say that first of all, I need a single column. So grid template columns. This is plural, right? So I need a single column, and the areas would be just header, sidebar, content, and foot. So I know that these words correspond to the header, the side, the main, and the foot content. And now just by setting, going back into a single column layout with 3 rows, if this is correct, I hope, when let's get it to like 700. So if the screen goes less than 700, the layout now becomes responsive in a way that we can see the header, the side, the main, the footer. And of course, now it's up to us to just play around with with the height. So make this. So probably in here, let me see if I can. So in here I can maybe set the grid template rows height, grid template rows um, to let me, no, where is it? Okay, in here. So now I have 3 rows, but I want like the, let me see why isn't it? Okay, it's just give me a minute. Okay, it works. And now I have to end this line here and then say grid template rows. So now I just want to change the height. So I want the first one to have like 1 FR, the side to have like, let's say 2 FR, and the main to have 4 FRs, and the footer to have 1 fractional unit. So basically I want to give more height to like the main content and the sidebar, and keep the footer and the header just, to a minimal height. So just by defining a media query and playing around with a few CSS grid properties, we have like a nice responsive layout. And you can take this as far as you want. Like you can have like a portrait in mobile view. You can have a landscape portrait layout with your media queries, and a tablet portrait, tablet landscape, maybe desktop or large desktops. And it's just as easy as setting up these template areas and playing around with your grid. And you don't have to change a single thing in your content, which is really cool. Your content remains the same, and it's CSS now, this special CSS grid areas system that takes all these elements and puts them on this grid just with CSS. So this is really, really life-saving tool. Before the CSS grid, we had to probably create 2 or more layouts and hide one when we went down from like 700 pixels, and then show the other one. So there would be like 2 sections. One would be set with display none if the screen width was some size, and then hide the other section and show the other, or do other all sorts of like hacks. But with CSS grid, like this is really cool. You define your content once, and then you can define your CSS layout, the layout, basically the UI layout, just with CSS and with simple CSS media queries, which is like, I think, awesome. So this is kind of like the last part. I want to say that there are more to the CSS script. So there are more like properties that you can play around. I wanted to cover like the fundamentals and probably the most helpful commands that we can use, that you can use. Now, I have a study guide and a practice guide. So if you want to really master CSS grid, and if you want to move forward and apply these skills and this knowledge, and make sure that you actually know how CSS grid works, I have prepared a couple of exercises. So I will share, and you will find this in the description below. I will share some reading guides, so some things that you should definitely read, and I also have a list of images that I encourage you to recreate using CSS grid. So I have this calendar, which is a bit, let's say, it's probably the most difficult of the designs, but it's going to be a really great opportunity for you to practice your CSS grid skills. So recreate this one, then a simpler calendar. I think this would be simpler to implement. And then have these layouts, try to create them just as you see them in here. So these boxes with this color. So try to use CSS grid to create these different layouts. Don't worry about the bar here. Okay, this is kind of like the browser's address bar. So just try to recreate these colored parts with CSS grid. There's some easy ones like this one, and there's some tougher ones like this one. And then I have some other exercise. So try to create a responsive design for this layout. and some Tetris. I think this is a great exercise. So try to recreate this with CSS Grid, and eventually you will get to know and get to work with CSS much more comfortably. And I also have some study and reading guides. So there's more reading that you should do. Practice, read, rewatch the lecture, and then move on to like the practice part.